In the quiet corners of history, there are stories not often told, stories shaped by human strength and human failure. This is one of those stories. The accounts we share now reach back through time to reveal moments that changed the world. Let us begin by traveling into a past long forgotten, yet still echoing into our present. Picture a company that invaded all and nearly kept it. Back in the 1600s, the Dutch West India Company did more than trade. It fought a war for profit. With money from investors and ships full of guns, it took the sugar coast of Brazil in 1630. It turned that colony into a business run by force. For almost 25 years, the Dutch held Brazil's richest lands. They built a kingdom led by account books. They shipped out sugar and suffering in equal amounts. At the heart of it stood Count Maurice of Nassau. He brought open-minded science and city planning to the coast. But all the while, his company used Brazilian wealth to fund wars in Europe. The people of the land fought back. Portuguese settlers, native allies, and African soldiers joined together. The rebellion changed the map forever. This is the tale of a corporate takeover that shaped an empire, and how Brazil first found unity through sugar, not silver or gold. Long before Portugal, this land was full of life. Great forests discovered river basins as big as countries. Many thousands of native nations lived there, connected by trails and rivers and shared surveys. People built big homes near clear, fertile land. They planted crops when the rivers said to plant. They moved with the seasons to care for the soil and follow the animals. This was not an empty place. It was a continent woven together by trade and family ties. It adapted to rainforest and grassland and shore. Difference was its strength. Over the centuries, scholars name over 2,000 distinct tribes. They spoke hundreds of languages and dialects. Tupi speakers lived along the Atlantic shore. Their canoes moved through lagoons and river mouths. The Guarani lived farther south and inland. They built villages that connected river valleys through family and exchange. Tapuya was a Tupi word for inland groups outside their speech. It was a name for many peoples, each with their own laws and wars and beliefs. These labels show influence, not sameness. Local rules and leaders changed from village to village. Farming was the anchor of daily life. People used careful fire to open small plots in the forest. They planted manioc, maize, beans and squash. Then they let the fields rest and grow back. Fishing crews read the river levels like a calendar. They set traps and nets when the fish were ready to spawn. Coastal families gathered shellfish and sea turtles. They dried fish to keep it and traded salt and smoked meat inland for pots, dyes and stone tools. The idea of a pure wild land falls apart when you see orchards of tended palms, earthworks that guide water and footpaths linking markets. Social ways were complex. Some groups practiced ritual cannibalism after battle. This was not a show but a spiritual act. It spoke of bravery, balance, and an end to cycles of revenge. Captives could be adopted, traded, or lost under rules the community saw as just. Feast speeches and songs shaped these events. War lived inside a code of ethics, not simple cruelty. Leaders rose through persuasion as much as bloodline. Chiefs settled fights and held gatherings to keep alliances strong. The land drew clear lines between ways of life. In the rainforest, long travel followed the rivers. So skill with canoes and navigation brought high respect. On the coast, the wind, the tides, and the reefs set the rhythm for fishing and seasonal meetings. Inland plateaus allowed bigger gardens and hunting paths that followed grass fires and animal movement. Tools matched the place. Hardwood boughs for forest hunts, big dugout canoes for mangrove channels, woven fish traps made for local streams. There are also curious ideas about visitors before 1500. Some writers speak of currents that might have carried Phoenician or Roman sailors west, or Norse travelers going farther south than known, or African navigators riding Atlantic winds. The proof is still debated, so see it as a maybe, not a fact. What is clear are signs of ancient work in the western Amazon. They challenge old thoughts about empty forests. In acre huge earthworks appear from the earth, precise circles and squares cut into the clay. These geoglyphs are like geometric signatures. They point to planned labor and ritual spaces in a managed landscape. Roads, ditches, and mounds line up with each other. They hint at settlements that worked the soil and water on a scale once thought impossible for the region. This shows native societies could organize work and knowledge across generations long before Europe crossed the ocean. In 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral sailed a fleet southwest to catch Atlantic current. Then he went farther west than planned. What later looked like a neat line on a map was a historic accident, a landing on a coast unknown to Europe's kings. After weeks at sea, the ships stopped by a sheltered shore in today's buyout, a stretch of sand and forest the crew called Porto Seguro. The first act on land set a tone of spirit. Sailors raised a wooden cross and priests held a mass under the open sky. This ritual mattered to the crown. Portugal had the right and duty to spread faith along with trade. The beachhead mixed ceremony and scouting. Carpenters cut wood for repairs. Water barrels filled from streams. Officers noted safe anchorages and reefs. Everything pointed to a quick stop, not a settlement. Early thoughts ranked the find low. Cabral's orders aimed for spices and cloth in the Indian Ocean. Their profits were sure and deals were already made. This coast offered no pepper or fine fabric. Lisbonese councils did not rush to spend money on a vast uncertain shore, so the crown treated it as a service station, a place for fresh water, food and soonest also of dye wood. Ships would stop, load and leave. Brazelwood or Pau-Brasil turned the shore from a stop into a workshop. Its heartwood gave a rich red dye for European cloth. Cutters learned to fell split and stack it for shipping. Small trading posts dotted safe coves. Middlemen there managed crews and guarded piles of wood. The tree gave the land a product and in time an aim. The work followed the seasons. Ships timed trips to avoid storms and catch winds that cut the journey home. Contact with coastal peoples started as cautious trade. Canoes approached. Gifts went both ways. Metal tools for food, trinkets for news. Gestures and signs built short minor-term alliances. They let Europeans camp, cut wood and sail away without a fight. But inequality waited in the background. Metal blades changed local power. Diseases would follow. And the mind that saw forests and people as supplies planted future herds. Portugal's eyes stayed fixed on the east. The Estado de India, a net of forts and posts from Africa to the Spice Islands, needed ships, captains and money. Lisbon gave Brazil only patrols, trading licenses, and a few trips to map the coast. Action against French poachers was weak. The crown kept rule thin to save cost. Loose watch defined the first decades. One small fact shows the priorities. Cabral's fleet carried more priests than soldiers. That ratio stressed faith and conversion over garrisons in those early days. Another visitor put the new shore on maps. In 1501, Amerigo Vespucci sailed along the coastline. He noted bays and river mouths. His accounts called it the land of the true cross, a holy name that pleased Iberian courts. French corsairs began to appear where Portuguese patrols were few. They traded with coastal groups and loaded Brazelwood in coves the crown barely knew. Raids by other Europeans followed. Complaints piled up in Lisbon. Unguarded harbors lost taxes for flags testing along coast. The message landed. Secure Brazil is a real holding, or watch rivals cut it out. King Joe I answered with a test in cheap colonization. In 1530, for he cut the coast into 15 captain seas. He gave them to the Notarios, nobles and soldiers. They got huge tracts plus rights to collect taxes, give out land and found towns. In return they had to bring settlers, raise defences, spread faith and make the place pay without royal money. Each captaincy ran deep inland from a strip of coast, a map that promised order on paper, but left the hard work to private hands. Reality tore through those paper lines. Many captaincies fell to the same blows. Attacks by rival Europeans, strong native-resistant shipwrecks that stranded supplies, fevers that thinned crews before planting. Distance from Lisbon slowed every call for tools, animals, or soldiers. Some grantees never even reached their land. Others landed, built a fort and a church, then saw their efforts shrink to a few woodsheds. Two places beat the pattern. Pernambuco and São Vicente found models that worked. Pernambuco's soil and climate welcomed sugar cane. Planters built HOS sugar mills that drew money-skilled workers and ships. Farther south, São Vicente became a base for exploration and farming that could feed settlers pushing inland. Their success pulled ships their way. It created centers of power where so many other grants left only marks on a chart. Martin Afonso de São Vicente, it started in 1532. His trip laid out streets, divided land, and set up a council to run daily life. He pushed for mills, planted crops, and tried to set rules for trade with nearby villages. That planned town council, fields and a watch on the bay became a guide for later tries to turn coastlines into communities, not just seasonal camp. Even the best miners-run posts struggled. The coast stretched for thousands of kilometers. Inland routes crossed unknown land where alliances could shift fast. Tropical sickness all through crews new to the climate. Supply ships came late or not at all. Without a central hand, each captaincy bargained, alone fought alone and found answers its neighbors already had. This wasted time and lives. The need for workers drove early exploration. Colonists forced native captives to clear fields, haul cane, and cut timber. They took people through raids or by bending alliances near Jesuit missions that gathered converts. Coercion built the first mills and farms long before enslaved Africans came in great numbers. The violence in this system shaped how wealth grew and who paid the price. The crown moved to bring order. In 1549, Governor Minas General Tom de Salvador on the Bay of All Saints as the first capital. From there a central rule could name judges, organize defense, and set taxes. Convoys began to group shipping. Garrisons got steadier pay. And letters from far miners off Captain Seas had a place to land. Pernambuco's planters soon boasted their strip of coast was the richest under the sun, a nod to sugar money. Meanwhile, some failed, the notarios gave up. They sold rights and untouched land in rough deals that looked like early land speculation. In the chaos gain, fields multiplied, mills turned through the night, and the sugar economy began to tie scattered captaincies into one Atlantic business ready to speed up. By the early 1600s, cane fields covered the northeast. Pernambuco and Bahia became belts of production. Plantations stretched from river mouths to low hills, each centered on an Engenhoe mill with boiling houses, presses, and storehouses. Landowners carved estates along good soil and steady water. They tied them to ports by ox cart roads and coastal barges. Harvest ran in cycles, cutting cane by hand, crushing it the same day, boiling juice through a series of pans to crystallize sugar for export. Coordinated labor, steady heat, and constant repairs kept the engines turning through long nights. Sugar rose as white gold because it paid in hard coin. European demand grew with habits in kitchens, pharmacies, and taverns. The Portuguese crown tapped the demand with taxes on every shipment. Merchants funded harvest months in advance, took cargo on consignment, and hedged risk by loading different grades: loaf, muscovado, and syrup. With each convoy is been counted customs, and planters paid debts and ordered tools, iron, and cloth for the next season. Profit rode on timing and volume. The base was forced labor. Across the 17th century, Brazil brought in more enslaved Africans than any other colony in the Americas. Slave ships linked West and Central African ports to Salvador and Recife. They offloaded men, women, and children, sold into work gangs. These gangs cleared forest, planted cane, cut wood for furnaces, and carried loads to the wharf. Death was high from overwork, disease, and punishment. Blight, sabotage, and organized resistance filled the other side of the ledger. People found ways to slow production, escape to forest, or defend maroon communities. Order ruled the plantation. At the top, senhores de Engenhoe held land, money, and political pull. Below them overseers enforced schedules and quotas. Skilled workers, boilers, carpenters, blacksmiths often got different treatment because breakdowns risked the whole season. Most enslaved people worked fields from dawn to night. They lived in barracks under strict codes. Sundays and holy days gave brief windows for markets, family ties, and community life. Across coastal towns, African cultures took root under pressure. Languages, drum patterns, and foods blended into new forms. Early Hindu Mbila took shape as ritual houses gathered Orisha worship, healing and mutual aid, often under the cover of Catholic brotherhoods. Dishes like aka and stews built on palm oil, okra, and cassava moved from plantation kitchens into city life. Music and dance held memory and offered a frame for dignity and unity that slavery tried to crush. Jesuit missions moved inland at the same time. Missionaries gathered native families into LDS, taught catechism, and pushed farming and craft. The defense of mission communities from slave raids caused constant friction with colonists who wanted labor and land. In council rooms, the fight over souls, rule, and property played out as lawsuits, royal orders, and sometimes expulsions or return. Salvador Orangeries, if it turned into busy Atlantic hubs, warehouses stacked sugar, tobacco, and hides. Markets sold tools, fabrics, and imported wine. Shipyards fixed caravels and built coastal craft. Brokers matched cargo with ships, secured insurance, and made lists for convoys that sailed with guards to cut piracy rift. News and goods moved both ways, tying Brazil into a global circuit. One plantation could support a noble house for generations, and those mills ran on clever water, power, and wood machines that needed teams of artisans to keep gears, troughs, and presses working. The system worked, and it drew eyes from rivals. Across the sea, Dutch merchants and their war company watched the profits and mapped the weak points in the chain. Europe's fight spilled into the Atlantic when Portugal fell under Spanish rule in 1580. This tied its empire to Spanish wars. Enemies of Madrid saw Portuguese posts as fair game. Privateers tested Brazil's long coast, probed harbor defenses, and traded with planters who needed credit. The sugar trade, already valuable, looked open to attack. In this era, a new kind of attacker rose, a chartered company with warships and investors waiting for dividends. The Dutch West India Company set its sight on the sugar belt, made to raid Iberian shipping, and seize colonies. The WIC mixed business and conquest under a corporate board. In 1620, for its fleet struck Salvador, Brazil's first capital, taking the city after a short siege. Officials fled inland. Storehouses, cannons, and records fell to the occupiers. Yet the hold proved thin. A joint Luso-Spanish force regrouped, cut supply lines, and retook Salvador within a year. This showed Brazil could still be defended when home and colonial resources pulled together. The Dutch fought again and returned where profit was thickest. In 1630, they captured Recife and Olinda, in Pernambuco, anchoring themselves in the richest sugar zone. This time they fortified islands, dredged channels, and secured mills through loans and contracts. Planters and debt shipped sugar through Dutch agents. The company tried to set prices, guard convoys, and keep refineries in Amsterdam fed. Control meant more than flags. It ran through credit, shipping schedules, and legal papers that tied harvests to the port. Rule shifted with the arrival of Count Johann Moritz of Nassau. He governed with a practical style, paving streets, building bridges, and planning neighborhoods to improve traffic between warehouses and wharves. He hired engineers to drain marshes and steady river banks, aiming to keep carts moving and ships loaded on time. He backed scholars and artists who listed plants, animals, and people, tying knowledge directly to rule. The maps and art from this time stand out. Naturalists like Georg Markgraf gathered facts on plants, animals, and climates that helped navigation and farming. Painters such as Franz Post made city scenes and country views that recorded mills, waterways, and the layered society around them. These works served as both propaganda and information, showing Europe a New Holland that looked orderly and profitable. Religious policy widened the city's people. Moritz allowed open worship, which drew Jewish merchants who organized trade and community life. In Recife, they set up Al Zur Israel, the first synagogue in the Americas. They joined a network, linking Brazil to Dutch, Iberian and Caribbean markets. Tolerance here was not just principle. It wove together money and logistics key to the sugar business. After Moritz was called back, unity frayed. Credit tightened, taxes rose and planter-company relations soured. Outside the fortified core, resistance grew. Local militias reorganized and Afro-Brazilian units and native allies used land knowledge to pressure outposts and patrols. The turn came with the battles of Guerra Rapes in 1648 and 1649. Their mixed militias used broken ground, ambushes and movement to blunt Dutch formations and drain morale. By 1650, for under siege and losing support at home, the Dutch gave up and left Recife. Some settlers went north and later filtered into New Amsterdam's merchant world. Yet marks remained in Pernambuco, canal lines, drainage nets and building methods that showed a Dutch chapter in the land. The company left, the scars and skill stayed. The colony stood harder and more united. And another pole began to glow inland as word spread of metal in the hills. Talk moved faster than caravelles. Traders in coastal taverns whispered about mountains that sparkled in riverbeds. Word moved inland, along old native paths. By the 1690s, obsession had a direction. The rough highland settlers called the Surto waterways cut through dark soils and specks. In pan told searchers they were not chasing myths. News kept pace with profit. Each small find pulled more men across the Serra Douma with tools, slaves and debts. Bandeirantes from Sao Paulo pushed hardest. They were but traders, part prospectors, used to long trips and hard bargains. Around 1690, their pans and roughs luces pulled grains from streams that fed the Rio das Vilhis and Rio dos. Camps became settlements, then regulated areas with rules, guards and way stations. A colony that once hugged the coast turned inland in months. Mules replaced coastal barges. Prices for tools and food jumped. Credit followed, and so did crown agents. Within a generation, Minas Gerais and at the center of imperial attention. By the 18th century, Brazil's output, near half the world's supply and Lisbonesque, port ran on the cash. Silver miners, boom, Portugal suddenly had a balance sheet that impressed Europe's lenders. Coins, jewelry and remittances pulsed through convoys and escort fleets. Officials counted chests, checked receipts and worried about leaks as smugglers learned every bend in the back roads. Towns seemed to rise from creek beds. Arrow Preta spread across broken hills and terraces, each slope crawled with diggings and scaffolds. Mariana and Sabora followed, drawn by veins that justified permanent streets, councils and brotherhoods. Churches crowned the ridges. Inside, gold miner sleeve covered carved altars and painted ceilings glowed when candles burned on feast days. Processions wound through lanes cut into laterite while tailings piled at the edges of town. The shine in the churches hid the pit below. Enslaved Africans bought at coastal markets and driven inland. In Kofles stood waste miners deep in cold water and gravel and carried loads from galleries held with rough timber. Floods collapsed shafts without warning. Lung disease, infections and exhaustion took lives at a rate planters and contractors priced into deals. Some fled to form keel MOS in remote valleys, trading with herders and hitting supply lines when they could. Lisbon tightened control with the Quinto do the Royal Fifth. Officials demanded 20% of all gold and built a machine to collect it. The Cosses defund ecosystem forced miners to bring metal to foundries where stamps fixed purity and tax. Unmarked dust became contraband. Searches grew intense. Patrols took animals under arrested carriers while amnesty offers tried to pull hidden stock back into legal channels. Despite controls, leaks thrived. Smugglers sewed dust into clothing seams, packed grains in picture frames and hid it in candles. Yet the flow that reached Europe still looked huge. Some historians say Brazilian gold helped pay for London's rebuilding in the 18th century, as Portuguese payments and British loans braided into Atlantic finance. Inside Brazil, new roads linked Minas to Rio de Janeiro and to Sao Paulo, while a regular mail route cut time for orders and news. The spine of a national network took shape on mining needs. Art kept pace with wealth. The Brazilian Baroque gave the towns a distinct faith. Heliad in OS carved prophets and church, front stoned rough, stone into lasting marks of the boom years. The cycle bred fortunes and anger in equal measure. As yields dropped and inspections grew harsher, bitterness mounted. Reformers in Lisbon read the lectures and saw both promise and leaks and a new plan of enlightened control prepared to press down. Power gathers in Lisbon when Sebastião e Carvalho rises as the Marquis of Pombal under King José I. He is not a court decoration. He acts as manager-in-chief. After 1750 he takes hold of ministries' councils on ports, knowing the empire's solvency runs through Brazil's exports and taxes. When the 1755 Lisbon earthquake levels districts and sets the river on fire with burst oil stores, rebuilding needs cash labor and a disciplined state. Pombal makes Brazil the fiscal backbone, and he crafts laws to squeeze steady revenue from a colony used to flexible deals. He reshapes administration with audit censuses and new paperwork that tracks cargo from plantation to quay. Governors get tighter orders and councils lose room to improvise. Customs officers gain power to seal warehouses and take contraband, while convoy schedules aim to cut insurance costs and piracy. The point is control. Few and middlemen clear paths for money to reach the treasury, and penalties that bite when rules are ignored. Local elites who once balanced smuggling with official trade find their margins squeezed by inspectors who now answer straight to the crown. State monopolies anchor the plan. The crown creates chartered companies to command circuits of people and goods. A Companhia Geral de Geral Minas Espere. Imanho runs the northern trade, coordinating African slave shipments with Amazon exports like cacao and drogas do Sertão. The Companhia de Ipanamboco Ipariba focuses on the sugar coast, bundling credit, freight and price, setting under one corporate truth. Diamonds and gold face separate controls with licensed districts, sealed packages and rural agents posted at choke point. Monopolies squeeze profit into official channels, which steadies tax flows and makes credit cheaper for loyal traders. Trade law hardens along metropolitan lines. Portuguese minus-only navigation rules push for merchants out of Brazilian harbors and direct freight to Lisbon and Porto. Consulates police contracts. Marine insurance shifts to Crown Minas-approved brokers. At the same time, Pombal targets the Jesuits who shield native communities and challenge civil power. In 1759 he expels the order from Portugal and its empire, taking properties and schools. The removal shatters mission networks. Thousands of native people lose legal and physical protection and face raids, forced moves and illegal enslavement despite formal ban. Education and bureaucracy move towards secular watch. New lessons stress arithmetic, engineering basics and practical language study to feed commerce and administration. Censorship boards check books and pamphlets, so Enlightenment ideas come filtered, useful for rule, hazardous if they encourage dissent. Pombal sponsors technical training for surveyors and customs clerks, building a group that can count, measure and report. He also steps into market behavior. To protest rising prices, he bans Brazilian sugar at the royal court for a time, signaling to planters and dealers that speculation will meet a pushback. His radical policies are instrumental and hierarchical. He formalizes the end of native slavery to steady frontier relations and to channel labor fights through civil courts. African slavery grows within the sanctioned trade, now organized through company fleets and licensed agents. The economy grows more tied, yet social violence deepens where free spaces vanish and enforcement tightens. Across parishes, audits of gold output, diamond fields under lock-in registry and company ships with set arrivals make Brazil clear to Lisbon in new ways. The system works on paper and often in practice, but strange shows. As inspections multiply and monopolies crowd out local bankers' resentment builds in towns and plantations, Brazil becomes richer and angrier, and the wider world shifts again. Wars in Europe reorder alliances, and the upheavals unleashed by Napoleon will soon send a royal fleet west, turning Brazil from revenues or sin to royal refuge. Napoleon's troops crossed into Portugal in 1807, and the Brigantic dynasty made a choice no European court had ever tried: evacuate to Brazil under British naval guard. Convoys loaded with baggage, archives and sacred objects pushed off from Lisbon. As French columns crossed the roads, the Atlantic became a royal highway. Over 10,000 nobles, officials, artisans and servants sailed with the court, turning a distant colony into the seat of a European monarchy. Weeks later, mass crowded Guanabara Bay, and the colonial harbour met a government in exile that planned to work at full scale. Dom João, then Prince Regent, stepped ashore in Rio de Janeiro and began ruling as if Lisbonese offices were just over the hill. Palaces and warehouses were taken over. Streets were cleared for processions and guard posts. The small administrative staff in Rio swelled overnight into ministries, tribunals and councils. Royal charters moved with the court, so decrees carried the same force as in Portugal. Rio shifted from a sleepy entrepot to the imperial capital by order and habit, not just ceremony. The first big policy stroke came fast. In 1808, Dom João opened Brazilian ports to friendly nations, ending 3 centuries of exclusive trade through Lisbon and Porto. Customs agents rewrote ledgers, and British, American and neutral ships lined up for entry. Tariff schedules favored allies, and a surge in imports, textiles, ironware, tools lowered costs for planters and merchants. Exports scaled up as sugar, cotton, hides and increasingly coffee found buyers without metropolitan bottlenecks. The policy reset the economy, shifting Brazil from a captive supplier to a player in wider markets. Institutions followed. A royal press began printing laws, gazettes and technical manuals, cutting delays in talk and encouraging a literate bureaucracy. The Bank of Brazil opened to handle government finance, issue notes, and steady payments between merchants and the state. A botanical garden took shape as a living lab for calibrating useful plants and supporting agronomy. Each move aimed at basic state capacity, credit, information and applied knowledge. Cultural life sped up under patronage. Theatres got licenses and subsidies. Schools trained artists and engineers, in the city's book trade grew with legal presses and private importers. Brazil began to look and feel like a kingdom in place, with rights, uniforms and paperwork to match. Behind the scenes, British influence grew. The Royal Navy guarded shipping, diplomatic envoys negotiated trade deals, and British merchants secured low tariffs and consular courts, making them the dominant partners in Rio's docks and counting houses. A curious result of the move was the scale of the royal household's library. Manuscripts and rare volumes, saved from Lisbon's World Rio's public collection, into one of the largest in the Americas. The city also felt the sudden population shock. The arrival of officials and retainers effectively doubled the people for a time. Food prices jumped, housing tightened, and landlords split rooms into rentable corners. As court demand outstripped supply, local elites learned fast how to work within the new order. Access to officers, contracts and honors strengthened plantation barons and merchants who aligned with the court. Patronage flowed into provincial networks, then loyalty to a Brazilian capital, rather than a far minus off Lisbon, reframed political identity. Talk in salons and chambers turned from colonial complaints to questions of status and rights within an empire headquartered in their own city. As the wars in Europe wound down, pressure mounted for the king to return. His departure would pull the center of gravity back across the ocean, but the institutions he planted in Rio could not be packed into trunks. The court's Brazilian interlude had already rewired trade, administration and ambition. The question that lingered was whether the new capital could go back to being a colony after governing as a kingdom. The liberal revolution of 1820 broke over Portugal and demanded a constitutional monarchy with authority restored in Lisbon. Committees in the capital drafted a charter, recalled exiled officials, and insisted the Brigânca attend its Brazilian stay. The demand struck the new order that had grown in Rio. Ministries, banks and presses worked there, as if Brazil were a co-minor sequel kingdom. Now the center of gravity was being pulled back across the Atlantic by a movement that promised law and limits on royal power. Dom Jovi I faced a choice between legitimacy at home and continuity abroad. In early 1821, he sailed for Lisbon with much of his household, leaving his son Dom Pedro to serve as regent. The prince was young, well known among Rio's elites, and tangled in loyalties. He owed obedience to his father and, at the same time, owed his place to the political base he had built in Brazil. As Jo's ships vanished over the horizon, local leaders wondered whether the next decrees from Lisbon would unwind everything done since 1808. The Cortes soon sent orders that aimed to reassert colonial control. They told Pedro to return downgraded Brazilian institutions and planned to fold provincial administrations back under metropolitan ministries. Customs houses, courts and army units got conflicting commands as new directives crossed existing practices. Merchants and planters who had prospered under open ports and royal favor feared losing contract titles and the informal access that made business work. They wanted reform that affirmed rights without stripping local autonomy. Debate moved from salons into councils and militia barracks. Newspapers printed constitutional proposals alongside letters from plantation districts. Lawyers argued whether the old Union of Kingdoms let Brazil keep institutions Lisbon had not created. Clergy and brotherhoods held meetings to weigh oaths on duties. Provincial juntas coordinated petitions that defended home rule while professing fidelity to the crown. A model took shape. Accept constitutional limits, but keep Brazil's executive in Brazil. By early 1820, the pressure on the regent sharpened. On January 9th he announced he would remain a decision remembered, as Fico aligning himself with leaders who insisted Brazil manage its own government under a constitutional frame. Ministers resigned and were replaced with figures close to Brazilian interests. Provincial commanders got orders from Rio, not Lisbon. The court retooled the bureaucracy to answer locally, unprepared for the chance that talk would fail. Months of mobilization followed. Slogans turned to organizing. Volunteer battalions formed in coastal cities. Inland towns created committees to secure supply lines and coordinate messages. Pamphlets linked enlightenment about sovereignty to recent American and Latin experiences. The goal was to secure recognition without plunging into a long civil war the economy could not bear. Still, skirmishes and standoffs flared where Portuguese garrisons held out and councils challenged Rio's authority. On September 7th, 1820, to near the Ipiranga River, the regent proclaimed Brazil's independence. Accounts suggest the day lacked heroic gloss. He was dusty, unwell, and riding with a small escort. Yet the act set the timeline in motion. New flags, decrees, and diplomatic notes sped to ports and provinces. Compared to neighbors, the split leaned on negotiation, recognition, and targeted force, rather than years of nationwide campaigns. By the year's end, Dom Pedro accepted a crown and became Emperor Pedro. By giving the new state a monarch, I see frame born on American soil. The empire would need to consolidate power, secure borders, and find revenue. And the first tests arrived before the income proclamations had dried. Brazil stood on its own and crowned Dom Pedro, a singular figure in the Americas, a monarch ruling an independent nation. The mood in Rio and major ports mixed ceremony with practical work. Diplomats sought recognition, provincial councils reorganized militias, and the court adjusted finances to cover loans taken during the separation. Newspapers praised unity, while merchants tracked exchange rates that decided whether customs revenue could pay soldiers and clerks. The new flag flew over a continental space, but building legitimacy needed more than symbols. It needed stable accounts, working courts, and the confidence of provincial elites who held land, labor, and credit. Optimism crashed into costs. War spending under arrears from the transition strained the treasury. Revenue depended on customs and internal taxes that often arrived late from distant provinces. Contractors advanced pay to garrisons and then demanded compensation and privileges. Rio de Janeiro's central offices began issuing decrees that touched every province, and resentment grew as local leaders saw their budgets squeezed to service imperial commitment. The sense that Rio set policy while others paid the bill hardened into a political habit that would define the decade. Pedro himself carried a second burden: inheritance abroad. As heir to Portugal, he lived with the expectation that events in Lisbon could pull him into dynastic politics. Correspondence with Europe shaped appointments and for loans, while domestic factions debated whether an emperor with family claims overseas could keep Brazilian priorities first. This ambivalence surfaced in council debate, army promotions, and the tone of newspapers that backed provincial autonomy. In 1820, for Pernambuco became the flashpoint. Federalist-minded leaders proposed a looser union and formed the Confederation of the Equator. Imperial forces marched in, the navy enforced blockades. After brief campaigns, the government crushed the revolt, arrested leaders, and reaffirmed its central authority. The outcome stabilized the map, but it left a record of grievances about tariffs, representation, and military command that did not vanish with surrender. Diplomatic work moved in parallel. By 1825, Portugal recognized Brazil's independence, a result achieved with British mediation and a £2 million compensation that locked in debt obligations. Recognition opened formal trade and eased the work of consuls and insurers. It also tied official policy to payments owed abroad, which kept pressure on customs houses just as the internal economy struggled to normalize. Inside the capital, politics grew rough. The Constituent Assembly worked on rules that would limit imperial authority and standardize provincial relations. Pedro's temperament, decisive and quick to confront, produced repeated clashes with deputies. Cabinet changes came fast. Street demonstrations grew. The scandal around his relationship with Domitila de Castro, the Marquis of Santos, widened church-state tensions, a conservative who linked moral order to political stability. Yet the institutional frame that emerged in 1820 carried an unusual mix. Broad guarantees for religion and the press and preserved powers for the crown. The emperor also left his signature in culture by composing the music for the first national anthem, aligning court ceremony with the new sovereignty. These gestures helped, but they did not quiet the drift of public opinion. Provincial newspapers criticized spending. Garrisons muttered about it. Ears and merchants complained about unpredictable policy. By 1831, protests coalesced into a crisis. Troop unrest and street pressure met a court weary of confrontation. Dom Pedro I abdicated in favor of his 5-year-old son Dom Pedro I and boarded a ship for Europe. Ministers stayed to keep payrolls moving and to hold the line while a regency learned to govern a restless empire. The throne sat empty in practice, and the regency tried to keep a sprawling empire stitched together. Councils in Rio issued decrees while provincial juntas bargained for troops and tax receipts. Governors rotated as factions and the capital split, and how much power to concede to the interior. Trade still passed through Bahia, Rio and São Luís, but convoys met checkpoints run by men who took orders from different masters. The structure looked constitutional on paper and improvised on the ground, which meant timing payrolls or moving a garrison could depend on a local loan, not a national budget. Tension cracked where distance and grievance overlapped. The Cabanage erupted in 1835 and bled for years, as rebels seized Belém, armed river communities and fought shifting coalitions of provincial and imperial forces. Death tolls climbed from battle, disease and reprisals, and the river network that fed the Amazon trade turned into a chessboard of blockades and raids. In Maranhão, the Bal Aida broke out in 1838, rallying artisans, vaqueiros and deserting soldiers against debt conscription and local elites. Cavalry columns spent years pushing bands into the backlands before authority reasserted itself. Far to the south, the Ragamuffin War began in 1835, as ranching elites in Rio Grande do Sul challenged tariffs and central appointments. Militias rode open country, created a separatist administration, and fought a grinding campaign until a negotiated settlement ended it a decade later. These uprisings unfolded alongside a national debate that hardened into party lines. Liberals argued that provincial assemblies should control police access and patronage, claiming local knowledge kept order better than distant ministries. Conservatives countered that only a strong centre could keep customs revenue flowing, secure borders, and standardized court. Newspapers aligned with clubs and brotherhoods and careers rose or fell with a governor's stance on provincial prerogatives. Behind rhetoric sat practical questions: who paid their ears, who appointed judges, and who commanded the garrison when streets filled. The Additional Act of 1830 tried to ease the pressure. It granted provincial assemblies broader powers over budgets and administration and created a new municipal framework. The move cooled some disputes but also emboldened separatists who read autonomy as license. In practice, provinces used their new latitude to shape police forces and local taxes, while ministries wrestled with uneven compliance and gaps in revenue. The Regency added councils and reformed statutes, yet it still had to rent loyalty with appointments and concessions when force could not reach. By the late 1830s, a solution many had dismissed gained traction: bring the emperor forward. The Golpe de Mayo died in 1840, declared Dom Pedro II of age at 14. The ceremony gave the centre a human face and a focal point for loyalty oaths, while allowing ministers to rebuild command chains that had frayed. The young ruler worked, read and listened. Audiences stretched late and correspondence piled high as he learned the map through petitions and reports rather than tours. Stability did not arrive overnight, but the tone shifted. Negotiations ended stalemates. Amnesties folded rebels back into provincial life, and the army reorganized under steadier funding, enforced settlements without the spectacle of mass reprisals. Courts regulated the procedures, and roads and telegraph plans entered ministerial agendas. Dom Pedro I's reputation for languages and study ranging from Hebrew to Sanskrit signaled a methodical approach, and his interest in emerging technologies later drew official support for photography and telegraphy as tools for governance. By mid-century, the empire had moved from triage to consolidation, and the horizon widened toward expansion of commerce infrastructure and the common politics that would soon define a high tide. Under Dom Pedro I, the empire settled into a long stretch of order. Taxes came in, roads stayed open, and governors answered to a centre that finally felt permanent. The court learned to plan beyond the next crisis. Bureaucrats mapped provinces, standardized weights and measures, and kept the customs houses busy. The army drilled, the navy patrolled, and the calendar filled with state visits and expositions that signaled a confident state. Coffee rewrote the map. Planters pushed into the Paraíba Valley and later into the highlands of Sao Paulo, carving rail beds to haul beans to Rio and Santos. With each harvest, new warehouses rose. Banks extended credit, and insurance firms followed the crops. Freight agents commissioned merchants, and dock crews found steady work. Coffee duty paid for bridges, piers, and street paving. City blocks near the port took on the look of commercial districts. Counting houses in front, storerooms behind, clerks upstairs posting prices wired from abroad. The slave trade's closure in 1850 cut off the Atlantic pipeline, but did not end bondage. Planters turned inward, moving enslaved people from the northeast to the coffee belt. Prices rose, families were split, and domestic traffic bound the interior to coastal markets. Police watched for contraband ships, while courts tried smugglers, but the plantation order held. At the same time, free labor expanded. Immigrant pioneers, first trickling in then arriving in contracts, began to appear on coffee estates. Wage books, still thin, started to sit next to slave ledgers. Steam made the distance smaller. Side wheelers pushed up river and coastal packets, stitched together Belen, Salvador, Rio, and Porto Alegre. The first rail line opened in 1854 and kept growing outward, linking valleys to ports and easing the movement of troops, mail and harvest. Telegraph wires caught up with the tracks and then outran them, letting presidents of provinces send orders in minutes instead of weeks. Schedules, rate charts and printed timetables entered daily life. The empire spoke to itself more quickly. Rio changed. Theaters filled with season tickets. Medical schools trained a steady flow of doctors. Law students debated in cafes and took clerical jobs in ministry. The imperial court bought instruments, books and lab equipment and made a habit of inviting lecturers from abroad. Collected specimens landed in cabinets and gardens. Surveyors drew clean lines across maps that had been empty space. Abroad, Brazil played as the senior partner in the neighborhood. It sent warships to show the flag, negotiated river rights and kept watch on borders from the Amazon to the Plata. Cadets trained with new rifles. Shipyards ray-planked corvettes and ordered iron hulls from overseas. The government signed loans in London, nursed its credit and kept an eye on commodity prices that could swing budgets from surplus to deficit. The emperor liked devices and rewarded the people who built them. He walked factory floors, asked questions, and funded projects that linked science to trade. At one World's Fair, he stepped into rooms packed with machines and met the people, advancing medicine and communication. Years earlier, when the first locomotives arrived, he did not just preside. He handled the controls for the inaugural run. For all the gloss the foundation creaked. Enslaved labor still powered plantations under rising abolitionist current, leaked from classrooms into newspapers and street meetings. Republican whispers threaded through officer clubs and Masonic lodges. And to the south, a conflict gathered force that would put all this organization to the test. From the railheads to the river gunboats, the order and confidence of the previous decade did not survive the border crisis. In 1860, Brazil's quarrels with Paraguay's neighbors pulled it into a coalition with Argentina and Uruguay against Francisco Solano Lopez. What began as a diplomatic standoff over river access and regime politics on the Rio de la Plata became a declared alliance once Paraguayan columns crossed into Mato Grosso and Corrientes. The timetable of peace rail shipments, customs receipts, scheduled steamers gave way to mobilization orders. Shipyards rushed hull repairs. Provincial presidents scrambled for recruits and supplies. The Navy concentrated on the Parana and Paraguay rivers, where forts commanded bends and mud shoals trapped careless pilots. Lopez counted on speed and geography. He pushed through marsh and gallery forest, seeking to disrupt Brazilian communications and to force Argentina to negotiate on his term. The plan faltered as the Allies pooled resources. Brazil's fleet, better armed and more numerous, probed upriver, while infantry slogged across wetlands that swallowed wagons and spread disease. Campaigns pivoted around river fortresses. Humor at his batteries set low behind earthworks, shredded and allied as Alton stalled, he advanced for months. Ito, chain-minus draped bastion with guns commanding the channel, turned into a siege that tested engineers and sailors alike. Gunboats had to thread currents under fire and pontoon bridges broke in storms. The course mounted. Supplied Ypres emptied faster than they filled. Hospitals overflowed with fever cases, dysentery and wounds that festered in the heat. Brazil expanded recruitment beyond free volunteers. Enslaved men who enlisted in army and navy units received promises of manumission on discharge, and thousands took that bargain. Provinces raised contingents, judges processed papers, and notaries recorded new names. The policy weakened plantation labor pools and pushed slave prices higher, tying the front to coffee districts hundreds of miles away. It also changed barracks life as units mixed backgrounds and created new loyalties that outlived the campaign. Leadership hardened in the field. Luis Silvestre, and E. Silva later, titled Duke of Caxias, imposed steady discipline, paced, advanced, and insisted on supply before assault. He wore down Paraguayan positions rather than chase quick glory. Officers learned to coordinate with the Navy to build corduroy roads across swamps and to keep artillery dry enough to fire after downpours. Don Pedro, I traveled south to visit camps and hospitals, listened to briefings, and stood with troops near the front, the only reigning monarch in the Americas to do so. His presence helped sustain morale and kept political factions at home aligned behind the war effort. The conflict drew chroniclers. Photographers and correspondents followed columns, setting up dark rooms in tents and sketching field maps that circulated in Rio and Buenos Aires. The public saw portraits of soldiers, river batteries, and flooded roads, an early form of war reporting that made distant battles feel immediate. Yet the images could not capture the demographic collapse underway. By 1870, Allied forces had broken Paraguay's defenses, pursued Lopez into the interior, and killed him in a final clash. The country that set the war in motion emerged ravaged, with its population cut by more than half, its towns stripped and its fields empty of working hands. Brazil returned with victory and heavy burdens. Declined veterans carried scars and stories of favoritism and corruption in procurement circled through newspapers and officers' clubs. The Army's new cohesion and confidence existed with resentment over late pay and political interference. Those tensions would not fade with the parade home. They followed the empire into the next debates over labor, citizenship, and who should command the future. Victory abroad hid strain at home. After the war, the empire carried new debts and a larger army that felt it had earned a political voice. Officers published memoirs, formed clubs, and pressed for promotions based on merit rather than patronage. Their pride in the campaign hardened into a quiet independence from civilian ministers. At the same time, provincial budgets leaned on coffee export taxes, and coffee itself set the rhythm of public life. Harvest, shipment, credit, and renewal. Ports thrummed, but the countryside showed the divide. Prosperous estates expanding into Sao Paulo's interior, while freed and enslaved workers crowded the margins of towns. Profit concentrated at the top. Planters refinanced mills, bought modern pulping machines, and ordered more rails to push lines deeper into the highlands. Credit houses in Rio and Santos steered capital towards those who already held land and access. Wages lagged in Durban. Services struggled to keep pace with migration from the interior. The legal end of the transatlantic trade had not undone the institution. Plantation ledgers still listed men and women as property in the domestic market, moved people southward to coffee zones, breaking households and carving a path for contraband. When prices rose, print culture attacked that order. Editors serialized anti-slavery arguments. Lawyers filed freedom suits, and lecturers toured theaters with proceeds earmarked for manumissions. Mutual aid societies and black brotherhoods organized festivities that doubled as fundraisers and forums. The cause reached salons and palace corridors. While the emperor kept his reserve, his daughter stepped into state duties during his absences and received delegations pressing for gradual law. Petitions multiplied for measures that chipped away at bondage registries, limits on sales, and protection for the children of enslaved women. Old allies drifted. The church, long integrated into imperial administration, bristled at state involvement in religious affairs and disciplinary matters. Bishops faced legal challenges that made pulpit disputes national news. The army, proud and better trained after the river campaigns, pushed for autonomy in promotions and doctrine. Coffee barons who had financed schools and local charities warned that emancipation without compensation would gut their businesses. Each camp wanted space from the crown, and each found reasons to resist decrees from Rio. The legislative route accelerated. Laws aimed first at new generations and at the elderly, creating pathways out of bondage on paper, then widening the terms. On-emission funds grew. Quilomo's persisted in hard terrain and flight towns rose as police controls loosened. When the final measure passed, it moved fast through the capital and provinces. Ceremonies erupted with bands and street parades. Plantation ledgers froze and owners saw assets vanish overnight. Workers searched for wages and land, often landing in the same fields under new contracts without schooling or relief to smooth the transition. The emperor, raging, undoffed, ill-travelled more for treatment, undressed and withdrew from daily bargaining with factions. He remained widely admired abroad and moved through Europe with ease, choosing low profiles that suited his temper. At home his main still anchored institutions, but the network beneath him had shifted. By the next year a group of officers and civilians, confident and organized, ended the dynasty without siege or broad bloodshed. The court packed, the flag changed, and the new regime kept the rail timetables running. Dawn broke over the Rio on November 15, 1889, and the empire ended without a firefight. Troops mustered on short notice. Officers exchanged brief orders in barracks and ministry courtyards, and the city woke to columns moving toward the center. Residents heard drums and boots rather than rifles. By late morning the monarchy was finished and a republic had been declared. No barricades, no street battles, only a firm transfer of authority carried out in daylight. Marshal Theodore Fonseca, long respected in the army, stood at the front of the move. He had once praised the emperor's steadiness, but years of disputes over promotions, cabinet intrigue and policy hesitations turned respect into distance. Senior officers urged him on, arguing that the crown no longer matched the country's needs. He weighed health troubles and personal loyalty against pressure from peers and then chose to act. The decision gave the movement a face familiar to veterans and provincial garrisons alike. The coalition behind him had been prepared by years of quiet organizing. Republican clubs printed pamphlets, lawyers drafted platforms, and professors hosted debates that spilled from lecture halls into cafes. Coffee magnates worried about labor after abolition and frustrated with the court's reluctance to recognize their influence offered funds and local connections. Younger officers, shaped by campaign experience and emerititos, found the Republican language of modernization and civic duty persuasive. When the march began, the alignment of ideas, money and command produced a clean execution. In the streets the change announced itself with symbols. The new green and yellow flag, familiar in palette, but reset with a central sphere and a fresh motto, went up on public buildings as clerks removed imperial emblems from offices. The color continuity softened the visual shock. The message underneath signaled a scientific, orderly future. Municipal workers logged in ministries, swapped seals, and telegraph offices relayed notices to provincial capitals. Routine absorbed the rupture. At the palace, the last act unfolded quietly. The emperor roused early Met officials who spoke in measured tones. He accepted the decision and prepared to leave. No attempt to rally regiments, no appeal to the streets. Carriages rolled, trunks were packed, and passage to Europe arranged. The royal household, which had anchored ceremonies and patronage for decades, moved offstage with minimal disruption to the workday of the city. Many residents learned of the shift only later. Shopkeepers closed ledgers at dusk and found headlines the next morning announcing a republic already in motion. The absence of gunfire gave the day an odd calm. Tram lines ran, markets open. A revolution had occurred between office hours. Theodoro took the presidency and formed a provisional government that leaned on the army for stability while drafting new rules. Decrees reorganized ministries, reset provincial authority, and mapped out elections. Currency, customs, and debt arrangements demanded continuity. The state kept them running while the legal framework changed. For outsiders, the signal that a new regime had arrived was the national flag's motto, Order me progress, lifted from a current of philosophy that prized rational planning. Designers assembled that flag in a matter of days, balancing inheritance and intention. The star map fixed the republic's imagination on the sky while the palette anchored it to familiar ground. Behind the scenes, exile settled in for the imperial family. Princess Isabel, central to abolition, did not return, and correspondence with friends shifted for unaddresses. The new order began with fatigue from the old and confidence in administrative speed. Timetables stayed posted, but the signatures changed. Then the next challenge would come from governors, learning how to navigate a state without a crown. The republic began with uniforms and decrees, then settled into habits set by land and export. Power polled in Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais, where coffee fortunes and cattle wealth funded newspapers, parties and governors who could move votes county by county. Elections occurred on schedule, but the outcome usually traced the will of men, known locally as coroner's patrons, who managed roads, police posts and payrolls. Ballot boxes travelled with escorts. They appointed under registries listed supporters who owed favours. Congress looked national. The machinery that fed it worked from ranch gates and plantation offices. Café Com Leet described more than rotation at the presidency. Banks in Sao Paulo discounted planter notes before harvesting, extended credit lines to rail syndicates, laying track toward the interior. Minas traded cabinet posts and electoral backing for tariff. Perks rivered regging and federal works that supported stockyards and dairy routes. In practice, the two states brokered compromises to keep customs revenue steady and interest rates predictable. When droughts hit the northeast or floods struck the south, relief followed. Political ties, not always need. Coffee demand kept infrastructure busy. The Sao Paulo railway crowded with freight. Santos widened wars and new lines pushed into the Mogi Iane Delta Paulista. Warehouses added mechanical lifts and exporters synchronized shipments with steamers bound for New York, Hamburg and Marseille. Municipal councils funded street lighting and piped water as factory belts formed along rail spurs. Workshops turned to machine tools, textiles, and food processing, feeding a growing urban workforce. Rio, now a federal capital without a court, built boulevards and public buildings that matched its role as a hub for customs, finance and diplomacy. Labor changed as ships unloaded new workers. Italians filled the first wave, followed by Germans and Japanese families who signed contracts for coffee estates or sought wages in town industries. On farms, colonial agreements made by plot and share, tying families to rows of trees and to the planter store. In cities, boarding houses and tenements filled near mills and yards. Mutual aid societies offered sickness funds, burial insurance and language schools, softening the first months of adjustment while shaping neighborhood politics. Federalism widened the space for local bosses. Governors controlled state police, built road concessions, and negotiated tax deals that favored allies. The center relied on Senate pacts to pass budgets. States bargained for exemptions in federal works. This autonomy produced a map of enclaves where courts followed the lead of patrons and strikes met quick repression. Wages fell behind rent and food prices spiked, with currency swings driving workers into new associations that tested the old order. By the 1910s, ideas arrived with pamphlets and returned migrants. Anarchist organizers printed small papers called General Strikes and trained in mutual schools that taught literacy in the language of rights. Socialist clubs debated municipal ownership and labor laws. The first unions cut their teeth on streetcar and textile stoppages. Police raided halls and deported foreigners. But the structure of collective action held especially in Sao Paulo's factory districts. Abroad, Brazil sought recognition in forums that measured modern state, centering the League of Nations in 1919. At home, officials tried to tame commodity cycles by buying surplus coffee and, when storage failed, burning sacks to hold up prices. The tactics saved balance sheets but inflamed criticism during lean years. As the 1920s war on harvest outpaced demand and world markets rattled, young officers staged uprisings, students stalked reform and provincial coalitions frayed. By the end of the decade, a politician from Rio Grande do Sul built across Minas State. Ticket around tariff relief, social legislation, a harder line against the old broker system, and the march toward confrontation gathered steam. The old broker politics cracked in 1930. Regional coalitions split after a contested election, and across Minas State, alliance marched on the capital with sympathetic officers. Getulio Vargas, a shrewd governor from Rio Grande do Sul, took the helm with military backing and began to govern by decree. He suspended the routines that had favored coffee oligarchs and wrote a new playbook from the presidential palace. Ministries multiplied, technocrats drafted codes, and federal inspectors arrived in states that had once acted like small republics. Vargas built a base by presenting himself as the protector of workers while courting factory owners who needed order and infrastructure. He centralized the collection of revenues and sent federal interventionists to replace state governors when conflict flared. New boards regulated currency, customs, and industrial standard. The government mapped railway junctions to industrial zones and steered credit to steel, textiles, and food processing. Ports gained cranes, warehouses, and customs scanners that quickened throughput. Tariffs, subsidies, and exchange controls shielded infant industries, while price policies tried to cushion coffee's booms and busts. Labor policy anchored his popularity. The state recognized unions through a licensing system, linked dues to payroll, and required employers to register hires. The modern labor card appeared on shop floors and in offices, tying benefits to documented work history. A minimum wage, overtime rules, and paid rest days entered everyday calculations for factories and workshops. Labor courts settled disputes with a paper trail that brought foremen, lawyers, and inspectors into the same room. Workers gained new leverage, but union independence narrowed because the ministry could suspend leaders and decertify locals that defied directives. With Brasilia decades away, Rio served as the stage for a crafted national identity. Radio networks carried speeches, music, and serial dramas that stitched together audiences from Amazon towns to coastal suburbs. Film institutes promoted newsreels of factories, harvests, and civic parades. Textbooks standardized civics lessons that paired maps, industries, and a forward-looking national story. Architects and urban planners used public works to signal modern competence. Avenues widened, public buildings adopted cleaner lines, and utilities expanded as symbols of discipline and progress. In 1937, facing polarization and citing plots, Vargas cancelled elections, dissolved Congress, and announced the Estado Novo. Censorship tightened. Newspapers ran with blank spaces or revised editorials. Opposition parties closed their doors. Police intelligence units grew and special tribunals handled political cases. The Constitution was replaced with a charter that concentrated executive powers, extended states of emergency, and kept the bureaucracy busy issuing decrees that touched school curricula, press licenses, and factory safety inspections. Authoritarianism and modernization traveled together, each reinforcing the other's reach. When war broke out in Europe, Brazil maintained neutrality while selling goods and bargaining for equipment. After U-boat attacks in the South Atlantic, the government sided with the Allies in 1942. Airfields, ports, and communications became strategic assets in hemispheric defense. Brazil raised and trained an expeditionary force that fought in Italy alongside US and Allied units. An overseas campaign that pushed logistics, medical services, and command structures to a new level. At home, steel production expanded and wartime contracts knitted Brazilian industry into broader supply chains. By 1945, the tide had turned abroad, and at home, wartime mobilization expanded the middle ranks of the military and bureaucracy, and returning officers pressed for elections and civil guarantees. Civil groups called for legality and an end to decree rule. Under growing pressure, Vargas stepped aside, leaving behind industrial plants, a labor relations framework, a stronger central state, and a population used to hearing national policy on the radio at set hours. The tools he forged would outlast his fall, shaping how governments, parties, and unions would bargain in the decades to come. The democratic opening after 1945 brought elections, parties, and a freer press back into daily life, but the ground under those institutions kept shifting. Cities swelled as people left rural zones for factory jobs and public service work, and ministries learned to govern a faster, more urban country. Budgets leaned toward power plants, highways, and housing, while parties stitched coalitions that depended on trucking guilds, union locals, and governors who could deliver votes. Inflation lurked, strikes tested police responses, and Congress worked through long nights to keep fragile agreements intact. The Fourth Republic rebuilt procedures, ballots returned on schedule, and a new generation of politicians learned to negotiate cabinet seats around economic plan. Industrial belts expanded around Sao Paulo Belo Horizonte, Rio bringing machine shops, car assembly and petrochemicals into the mix. Radio and print widened, debate and courts handled electoral disputes that once would have fallen to provincial bosses. Urban planning became a national conversation as neighborhoods sprawled into new suburbs tied together by buses and paved arteries. Vargas reigned in a center that whirled by winning the 1950 vote and took office in early 1951. He revived state-led development, pushed for control of key sectors, and backed wage policies that spoke to workers squeezed by rising prices. Business lobbies, conservative parties, and major newspapers countered with charges of waste politicized unions on creeping statism. The standoff hardened as inflation rose and street rallies grew larger. Under severe pressure in 1950 for the presidency ended in a national shock that produced days of mourning and a wave of public sympathy strong enough to unsettle his fiercest critics. A new emphasis on growth followed. Juscelino Kubitschek, elected in 1955 and taking office in 1956, promised rapid advance and delivered projects that reorganized the map. Federal highways connected inland towns to coastal ports, dams fed grids that powered factories, and an auto industry took shape, with foreign manufacturers setting up plants under protection. The most visible piece was Brasilia, a planned capital built at speed on a high plateau, which pulled civil servants and contractors hundreds of miles from the coast and signaled a bet on the interior. The effort demanded moving tens of thousands of workers to a work site that became a city in just 41 months. Growth had costs that mounted as the decade closed. Imports for machinery and fuel strained foreign accounts. Consumer demand ran ahead of supply and inflation ate into salaries. Labor federations pressed for adjustments while students and professionals called for broader social reform. The military watched these tensions and mapped contingency plans amid Cold War alarm. U.S. diplomats and officers tracked events, clunchily linking aid packages to policy signals and treating the country as a key node in hemispheric security. Jorge, a longtime ally of Vargas, entered the presidency after crisis and compromise. He pushed a program that mixed land redistribution, higher minimum wages and partial nationalizations, with proposals to regulate foreign remittances. Governors split, Congress stalled, and markets wobbled as rallies formed against the plan filled downtown avenues. Food prices climbed, rent strikes spread, and some unions announced general stoppages. Offices split into currents, with moderate commands overshadowed by hardline groups that saw a narrowing window to act. In early 1960, for demonstrations, counter-marches and mutinies converged. Naval units signaled defiance, business groups funded logistics, and church networks mobilized street support. Warships from abroad moved into position under a pre-planned operation, while armored columns advanced with little resistance. The president left office. Broadcasts announced command. A new regime installed itself, promising order and development through control rather than debate. The new regime, called the 1960 for takeover, a corrective revolution, and set about rewriting rules. Decrees suspended constitutional guarantees. Generals appointed state governors, and a rolling series of institutions lacked state and control. Parties were shut, rebranded, and folded into a managed to party structure that kept ballots but clipped choices. Congress stayed open on paper, yet keel oars moved by command. Intelligence branches expanded under national security laws that defined dissent as subversion. Police units built networks of informants, uncoordination with allied services tracked students, clergy, and union leaders across borders. Censorship arrived in layers. Editors received phone calls with forbidden topics. Film boards cut scenes and theater scripts returned with lines struck out. Journalists swayed wording that might pass midnight reviews. Professors lost posts and textbooks were revised to stress discipline and economic planning. Courts prosecuted crimes against national security, a broad category that covered leaflets, meetings, and songs. Thousands were detained, many pushed into exile, and some vanished into interrogation centers that operated behind innocuous facades. The map of fear spread through cities where an ordinary office door could hide a cell. Yet cranes and bulldozers also filled skylines. From the late 1960s into the 1970s, growth surged as loans and for uncapital funded steel mills, petrochemicals, dams, and expressways. Companies set up assembly lines under tariff walls that promised market share if they produced locally. Cities added overpasses and towers. Ports installed container equipment. The power grid stretched into new regions. Statistics made nightly news, celebrating output kilowatts and paved kilometers. The miracle raised incomes for some and expanded a consumer market for appliances and cars. The gains were uneven. Wage controls and curbs and strikes held labor costs low while inflation ate purchasing power. In the countryside, mechanization and land concentration pushed families towards cities that could not house them. Favelas grew along hillsides and floodplains where buses reached but sanitation lay. The state lifted flagship industries but schools and clinics trailed. Economic ministries targeted growth rates. Social services absorbed the overflow without catching up. Culture found ways to push back. Students marched where dispersed, regrouped, and formed study circles. Underground newspapers used small presses and rotating addresses. Musicians and artists layered meanings to slip past censors who banned certain words, images, and even colors. Tropicalia wove electric guitars northeastern, rhythms and urban irony into songs that carried critique under playful surfaces. When works drew attention, arrests and forced departures followed. Yet the blend of experimentation and coded dissent left a mark that endured beyond the crackdowns. By the mid-1970s, the security apparatus reached its peak, then faced fatigue and scrutiny. Allegations of torture, once whispered, circulated more openly. Some officials argued that repression had achieved its objective and risked delegitimizing the state if it continued unchanged. A controlled easing began. The government loosened press rules, restored some political rights, and allowed cautious competition within the managed party system. The pace stayed uneven with reversals after bombings and scandals, but the direction tilted toward opening. Economic headwinds hastened the shift. Oil shocks raised import bills, debt piled up, and inflation returned with force. Growth slowed, layoffs mounted, and middle-class patience thinned. Civic groups organized petitions, church networks hosted forums, and professional associations coordinated campaigns for electoral reform. The direct-as-you wave drew crowds in plazas across the country, combining concerts, speeches, and legal proposals that centered on one demand: direct national elections. Though the immediate bid failed, the pressure forced a political transition on the regime's terms, but to a civilian finish. In 1985, the transfer occurred without a civil war, and the country stepped into a new phase that would test how to rebuild rights after 2 decades of rule by decree. Democracy returned in 1985 after 2 decades of generals, and the transition opened with restraint rather than rupture. An indirect electoral college chose Tancredo Neath to lead the hand over a compromise figure acceptable to opposition and parts of the regime. Illness struck before inauguration, and he died, leaving a vacuum at the threshold. José Sarney, the vice president and a former ally of the old order who had crossed over, took office. He faced a state with inflated budgets, index contracts that fed price spirals, and a public hungry for rights and stability. His administration restored political freedoms, legalized parties, and convened a constituent assembly to write new rules while battling hyperinflation that reset grocery prices between paydays. The assembly finished its work in 1988. The charter brought in social guarantees, set term limits, decentralized funds to municipalities, and reasserted civilian supremacy over the armed forces. It expanded the role of prosecutors and public defenders, created new oversight bodies, and set out environmental protections. Courts gained tools to hear collective actions, and social policy moved onto a constitutional footing. The framework was ambitious and expensive, and it landed on an economy still spinning. Price freezes, currency swaps, and wage guidelines cycled through without lasting success, and corruption scandals eroded patience. Even so, civic groups, investigative reporters, and neighborhood associations gained influence as media and public debate flourished. Stability arrived in stages during the 1990s. Fernando Henrique Cardoso, first as finance minister and then president, replaced indexation with the real plan, anchored expectations with a new unit of account, and tightened fiscal policy. A central bank with clearer mandates gained credibility. Privatizations and regulatory agencies restructured telecoms, mining, electricity, and ports. Trade liberalization lowered tariffs and integrated supply chains, while social indicators began to track improvements in schooling and vaccination. The currency held, inflation fell to single digits, and credit returned on terms the Treasury could manage. The 2000s shifted the focus to inclusion. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva took office with a pledge to maintain macroeconomic anchors while expanding income support. Conditional cash transfers consolidated into Bolsa Familia, tying benefits to school attendance and health checkups. A rising minimum wage, formal job growth, and commodity demand from abroad lifted incomes and consumption, especially in smaller cities. New universities and federal institutes opened seats to first-generation students, and housing programs extended mortgages to low-income families. Brazil's global profile rose with diplomacy in the global south and bids to host major events. The cycle turned harder in the following decade. Corruption probes uncovered schemes in state-linked firms and contracting networks, snaring parties and executives. A recession hit, commodities slumped, and fiscal gaps widened. Political coalitions fractured, and Congress advanced impeachment against President Dilma Rousseff in 2016, ending her term and deepening polarization. Populist currents gained control. Social media amplified conflict and security concerns, climbed with homicide spikes in some regions. Institutions absorbed the shock. Courts adjudicated cases at the highest levels. Electoral authorities ran eye traces, and independent media covered every turn. One detail from the constitutional moment stands out. The 1988 document turned the nickname the Citizen Constitution for its breadth, with hundreds of articles on rights and duties. Another marker came from the global stage. The 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Rio Olympics drew the world's attention and tested logistics, budgets, and public trust in grand projects. Through swings in policy and fortune, the country kept competitive elections, a decentralized federation, and a culture that sent music, film, and sport across borders. By the third decade of the century, the long arc from native politics to republic rested on a public that expects a voter voice and institutions that can weather another turn of the cycle. Profit had drawn the borders. A company chasing sugar profits built forts, books, and a coastline worth defending. Money ruled before laws and contracts bound more than treaties ever did. So when raid turns violent, who really shapes a nation? Voters or investors? Keep that in mind as we move inland, where gold replaces sugar and fortunes shift. And so this chapter of history slowly fades into the quiet flow of time. Some mysteries remain unanswered, and some truths continue to shape our world. We have walked through the past together and learned what it can teach us. If you carry this knowledge forward with you through each day, then the echoes of history will never be lost. Thank you for listening. Until next time, let the past remain alive in your mind.